This is nothing but that sports talk.
And welcome to Nothing But That Sports Talk. I'm Rafique Louison, back again, Knox Louison. Welcome back. It's very nice to see. I see you bust out the Miami Heat attire. I mean, why not? Since you're wearing
Heat
that,
back, championship.
since you're wearing that, why don't we jump into what we talked about, like literally a couple days ago, which is the Christmas Day games. I mean, it's pretty much a one-sided affair between the winners. Let's be honest, including the Miami Heat, but. Yeah, which team you thought performed the worst in those games?
So the team they clearly performed the worst was Golden State. A lot of that's not fully their fault. Their team is definitely not the same team that they were a couple years ago, even last season for that matter. But the team I think disappointed the most was probably New Orleans. I thought New Orleans would have put on a better show as a team. Zion played really well, and Zion showed, he's going to be on his way to being one of the better players in the league for a long period of time, so long as he stays healthy. But the team as a whole didn't really play too well. You can't fault them too much, teams didn't have training camps, teams didn't have summer league, but I thought they would have played better than they did.
I mean, it's kind of tough to say because you're going up against the conference champions from last year, well, the Eastern Conference champions from last year. And Duncan Robinson was on fire with 6 3-pointers in the game.
Yeah, Miami played well. Taking nothing away from my Heat, we're a good team. I'm curious to see what we do this season because a lot of teams now are going to be game planning for us. So it's going to be a lot different from last year where we kind of crept up on people where they weren't expecting us to be successful. But the Heat played well. They played a good game. But like I said, I just think New Orleans could have had a better showing. A lot of teams that did get blown out, there's reasons they got blown out. As I mentioned, Golden State having injuries and not being the same team. The Mavericks not having Kristaps Porzingis. And then some other teams, I guess Boston too. Boston, they got washed.
Yeah, but getting to Boston, it's not to say that the Celtics weren't good. It's just when you're going up against a duo, KD and Kyrie, the way they played, coming off a blowout win against the Golden State Warriors a couple nights ago, a blowout was coming. When KD was going off for 29 and Kyrie was going off for 37, do you see this duo having at least a 10 to 15 game winning streak going forward after wins like this?
10 to 15 games is hard. That's a lot of games, a lot of nights where you have to be on your top and the other team has to be less than their best as well. It's possible though. I'll say this, man, and I'm a Heat fan, but I'm also a Brooklyn Nets fan. I live in Brooklyn, so I always got to cheer for the Nets. That team is really deep. That roster is really deep. And that starting lineup is such a headache. You got to consider Kyrie's a lethal scorer, but now you pair him with Spencer Dinwiddie, who's a pretty high IQ, smart guy. He can play the one or the two that can interchange. Joe Harris is a knockdown shooter who has better scoring abilities outside of shooting than people give him credit for. And then playing KD at the 4, that's a mismatch. He's a mismatch for guys at the 3. If you're moving him now to the 4, it's even bigger mismatch. And you can go DeAndre Jordan or Jared Allen just for activity in the front court and some defensive rim presence. 10 to 15 games is tough. But it's not impossible, man. It's not impossible. I know it's just 2 games, but they look good.
It's not. I mean, this is one of those moments where you get so hyped, but you got to keep in mind, it's just 2 games.
Right.
But one of the first 2 wins did come against a team that missed the playoffs last year, courtesy of Stephen Curry missing most of the season and Klay Thompson missing the first of 2 seasons. Yeah. Let's not forget the fact that the Brooklyn Nets they had Karis LeBron, who's literally the most underrated Brooklyn Net that we've had in quite some time. I mean, the last time the Nets were playing the Celtics in Boston, he went for 51. I mean, you definitely not going to see that this season thanks to the KD and Kyrie show. But you know what? He's going to be a main problem if KD or Kyrie can't play.
Yeah, he's a good addition, not addition because he's been there a long time. He's a good factor in the team because he's really interchangeable. You can kind of play him at the 1, you can kind of play him at the 2, you can kind of play him at the 3. He's not a lockdown defender by no means, but he's a competent defender. He plays defense. He can put the ball on the floor. He can drive. He can shoot occasionally. He's a kind of do-it-all player, and he's actually now in a better position because I think previously too much of the workload was on him. I think last year, once Kyrie was constantly in and out of the lineup, it kind of became the Karis LeVert show. The year before that, he started off really strong, and then he got injured, and it became D'Angelo Russell's team. Then they went to the playoffs, and him and D'Angelo kind of never really meshed together well on the court, But now this year, they've kind of given the reins hey, man, you're the 6th man. Just come out here, just do what you got to do. And I know it sounds simplistic, but for a player like that, where he doesn't have the pressure of having to carry the team, he does it, and he can plug in if any one of them get hurt.
Yeah, but this is going to be very difficult for Karis LeVert to get adjusted to having a breakout game at some point down the road of this season. Now that KD's finally playing, and well, KD, he's literally doing a lot better than we thought he was going to do. I mean, we're talking about an MVP candidate. Do you see him win MVP as a Brooklyn Nets?
Well, I'm not going to say who's going to win MVP after 2 games. I will say that if they continue to play at anything that looks like this level, he's going to at least be in a conversation. And I expect them to be playing at this level for the majority of the season. So I think he'll be in the conversation. I think he has a legitimate better than 50-50 chance of winning MVP. Number one, he's the second best player on the planet when healthy, and he has the ability to be the best player on the planet at any given time. It's either him or LeBron, and he can be better than LeBron whenever he feels like it. And he's in a situation where he clearly looks comfortable. He clearly looks happy. He's around guys who he has good on the court chemistry and off the court chemistry with. That's a fact that I don't think a lot of people take into consideration. Like, he has a good outside of basketball relationship with Kyrie and Karis and DeAndre Jordan. He's comfortable. He's happy. He's healthy. He's the second best player on the planet. There's no reason why he can't win MVP.
Exactly, especially since you're being coached by a 2-time MVP, Steve Nash. It's basically the 2006-2007 dynamic duo all over again. They knew how to run that 7-second offense. I'm referring to Mike D'Antoni, the assistant coach, and of course Amari Stoudemire, the coaching staff as well. When you have that coaching staff, it's basically the 2006-07 or 2000s in general Phoenix Suns coaching the Nets this season. Let's be honest. Not
only that, but it adds to that team chemistry. Like, so granted, this is Steve Nash's first coaching experience, but he's played for Mike D'Antoni. Granted, this is Amari Stoudemire's first coaching experience, but he's played with Steve Nash and had his most success with Steve Nash, and he's played with Mike D'Antoni. So that familiarity between the coaching staff and then the players on the court, I don't want to say it's a perfect scenario, but it's a very ideal situation. Like, I think all of those people individually have huge egos, but I think they're around people that keep their egos in check because they have such good working relationships with each other.
Yeah, and that working relationship could lead to more blowout wins down the road in the season if the Brooklyn Nets can keep it up.
Can win a championship, lead to championships, hopefully.
Or at least a runner-up.
I mean, granted, it's just 2 games, but the way that they're playing, if they continue that same style and health ultimately is what comes down to it. The Nets will win if they stay healthy. It's really that simple. But the problem is their 3 best players have all had terrible injury histories. Karis LeVert's always had problems with his feet. Kyrie's always had problems with, his knees and his shoulders. And Kevin Durant, you never know with him. So if their 3 best players can stay healthy, look out.
Yeah, look out indeed. But do you consider the Brooklyn Nets blowout win over the Celtics the best during Christmas Day, or was there any other game that's a lot better? Or to put it in simple terms, which winning team had the greatest blowout win on Christmas Day?
You mean like who looked the best, like who performed the best?
Yes.
Yeah, the Nets definitely look, because the Nets were the one team going against another team of equal status. Like Milwaukee went against Golden State, they're not equal. New Orleans went against Miami, they're really not equal either. Granted, I think the Clippers and the Nuggets is a rematch from last year's playoffs, but those teams are not really equal if you want to be honest about it. Boston and Brooklyn are division rivals. They're both expected to be the top of the conference. So for them to just come in there and kind of steamroll them, much like they did in the preseason, that's impressive.
Yes, it really
Although
is.
I will say this, Boston's without Kemba Walker, and that's a huge loss for them.
Yeah, Kemba Walker does not play. Well, the Celtics, they're just slightly worse without Kemba Walker. But if Kemba Walker was on the court, we would have probably had like a close game down the stretch like we did the other night when Jason Tatum hit that crazy shot that was almost wasted by Giannis Antetokounmpo's free throw attempts a couple nights before.
Do you think that they're slightly worse without him? I think that they're significantly worse without Kemba Walker. They need him.
Just slightly, because remember, you still got Jason Tatum who can come through in the clutch. Look at the other night against the Milwaukee Bucks.
I mean, I love Jason Tatum. I think he's on his way to being a top 5 player at some point in time. But you can't substitute what Kemba Walker brings, not only as a leader, but as a big shot maker and also as a 20-point scorer. So I think they're significantly worse without him, not just slightly worse without him. Because what happens is then Tatum has to take on too much of the scoring load. and he has to go into like that Kobe mode where he was playing in his second season, and they weren't doing too well when he was playing like that.
Yeah, that is true. That's completely true. And you really had when Kobe rolled the other night, and again in that game against the Milwaukee Bucks, that was like literally crazy, but not as crazy as well. Let's see what happens with Jason Tatum's development as on the court. I mean, he doesn't mean development, but from a standpoint in which you're trying to lead that team to a championship, he kind of do in a way.
Right.
But which crazy play stood out to you the most during the first week of the NBA season between the play that I just mentioned earlier with the Celtics and Buddy Hield's game with tip into CJ McCollum's go-ahead shot? Which play you thought was the best?
I'll go with at the time of recording this last night with Houston and Portland. Not necessarily one play, but like just to see CJ and James Harden go back and forth down the stretch, basically trading baskets. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, it really was. That was like literally one of the craziest games you'll ever see in a Houston versus Portland matchup. I mean, Damian Lillard could hit the game winner, proving that he could pull it like Kobe, but things happen. It's just one of those things where you can only be competitive if you can't win the game.
Portland was pretty competitive. Houston is a tricky situation, man. I mean, they were without 3 or 4 players last night due to protocol testing and stuff. Protocol quarantine. I got a question for you, man. Where do you think James Harden ends up?
Obviously, he's staying with the Houston Rockets because, I'm not going to repeat what he did over the broadcast because it's just something we can't talk about a family-friendly podcast. But James Harden, he knows what he needs to get together and get himself together in leading the Rockets to the promised land, which is going to be difficult when you compete against LeBron James' Lakers or teams like the Clippers or the Nuggets.
So you think he stays in Houston? He doesn't get traded?
Yeah, he's staying in Houston.
You think he stays there for the rest of his contract or just for the rest of the season?
At least for the rest of the season. I don't see him getting traded nowhere. Not right now anyway, because a lot of teams that they're willing to trade for James Harden, they don't want to give up their top players.
That's a good point. I think he backed himself into a corner. And I think he was trying so hard to get out, he didn't realize he was kind of deterring people from letting him in. So teams were looking at his actions like, yeah, that's not really becoming of a franchise player. Or he's not just a franchise player. He's literally one of the faces of the NBA. He's top 3, top 5 faces in the league. So his actions were really deplorable. I can't think of too many teams that are willing to really trade for him at the moment. What I think might happen is there may be a team or two who underachieve, or they get an injury to a star player that they weren't expecting, and then they're no longer in contention, or they're starting to fall out of contention, and then they pull the trigger on a James Harden trade. But as it stands right now, I don't think anyone's really clamoring to get him. I mean, he's clearly out of shape. Like, he looks like he put on 15 pounds in the wrong places. And his actions, like we mentioned before, haven't really been painting him in a good light. So I think teams will hold off from making a trade for him. But I do think if someone gets off to a slow start or someone gets a really bad injury, and by someone I mean a team, obviously, I think they'll make a trade for him. Yeah,
that could actually happen because any team that's literally struggling to stay in playoff contention, James Harden could be the weapon they need.
Right, and not only just a weapon. I mean, he brings you into contention right away,
Exactly. I mean, Brooklyn's good where they're at. Miami's good where they're at. And Philadelphia, they're passable where they're at. Speaking of Philadelphia, how about their blowout win over the New York Knicks and the win over the Washington Wizards the other night, despite the fact that Russell Westbrook went off for a triple-double?
Philadelphia, I think, might have been the most improved team in the offseason. And it has nothing to do with Glenn Rivers as a coach, because I don't think he's a particularly good coach. It has a lot to do with the makeup of the team. One of the problems they had last season was they had no shooting. They had no outside shooting. So every time Embiid got doubled and he kicked it out to someone, they were going to brick because they didn't have any real shooters. Steph Curry changes that. I think Danny Green, when he's on, he's on. He oftentimes is not, but when he's on, he's on. And I think one thing Glenn Rivers is really good at doing is enabling players to do what they do best, which sometimes comes back and haunts him. But, I think he makes players very comfortable and players like to play for him. So you see Ben Simmons is very loose out there in those first 2 games. He's kind of moving well the flow of the offense and things like that. And Embiid's cut back on the amount of threes he was taking, which is good. I think it's important for him to cut back on the threes because, honestly speaking, there's nobody can guard him in the paint. He's unguardable.
Yeah.
There's no big man who can guard him in the paint, maybe outside of AD, but then much like AD, he can step out and hit a mid-range jumper or extend it to 3-point range. So I think Philadelphia will probably finish top 3 in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, when Joel Embiid gets going, he really gets going. You've seen that against the New York Knicks, but then against the New York Knicks, was that really hard to do?
The Knicks are terrible, but
yeah. I don't really know what to say about the New York Knicks. I mean, that was just one of the 2 predictable blowout losses they've had the first week of the season.
What do you think? Go ahead.
But you know what? They'll eventually come around. I mean, it's due to the fact that we didn't get to see Emmanuel Quickly and Obi Toppin play in the second game due to their injuries. But when they do play, how developed do you think they're going to be down the road of the season?
You ask me how do I think those players will develop or how the team?
The players are going to develop. I
don't know. Tom Thibodeau is one of those coaches where if you don't perform, he's not going to play you. I think there's a couple guys on the Knicks roster right now who might not be in the NBA in a couple of years because they're just not going to get any time. And if they don't perform this season, it kind of puts an end to their careers, just being honest. As for Toppins and Quickly, I wasn't a big fan of the Obi Toppin pick. I'm still not a really big fan of the Obi Toppin pick. Quickly looks like he could be a steal, but I don't know, man. The Knicks just have to get into the habit and to the skill of developing players. Develop them. I'm at a point where I feel like RJ Barrett, I think he had a rough night last night, right? He went like 2 for 17 or something.
Yeah, he could not score the other night.
I'm okay with that, though. Because you know why? I liked his aggression. He didn't stop shooting. He didn't stop attacking the basket. He didn't stop trying to make plays. He didn't sulk on defense. That's what you have to do. I want him to shoot the ball. Shoot, get better, get your reps in, get your experience up. Because too many times the Knicks draft players and they protect them and hold them out from playing like the way they do with Porzingis, or they don't develop them at all. And you can't develop players if they're not playing and they're not allowed to make mistakes. So when it comes to RJ, listen, man, shoot the ball. Mitchell Robinson is a different case. He's like a walking foul. I don't think I've ever seen a player with such poor defensive discipline. But at the same time, he has really good defensive skills. Like, he's a great shot blocker. He's athletic. He's quick. But his discipline on plays is really horrible, man. He picks up fouls like a magnet to the point where you really can't even play him.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, you notice his scoring numbers isn't really that great either.
Yeah, his offense isn't there, but at least he has a defensive presence. But the problem is he just gets too many silly fouls. And you want to play young players and let them make the mistakes, but at the same time, you want to compete in games. It's hard to compete if you're getting a foul every 2 minutes.
Yeah, the Knicks have had a tough time competing, period. Well, the first half of those games, they were all right, but it's just the second half, you can barely stay competitive. I mean, they looked literally lost in the third quarter against Philadelphia, especially when the three-point shooters of the 76ers were going off like crazy.
Yeah. I think a problem that the Knicks have is they have players who are extremely flawed. Like, Elfrid Payton is their probably best perimeter defender, right? But he can't shoot for his life. So teams know to leave him open. So you technically can't play him because he's a bit of a liability. Julius Randle, he's a good player, and I like that they're utilizing his ability to create, but he can't be your main point guard. That's half the problem. If you look at the game last night with Philadelphia, RJ Barrett really shouldn't have to work that hard to get a shot. There should be a point guard in the team who can get him an open look, who can get him an easy cut to the basket, but he has to create all the time for himself. That's not good. I mentioned Mitchell Robinson's ability to constantly pick up fouls. Who else even on that roster? Oh, God, it makes it terrible. Dennis Smith Jr., yeah. Frank Ntilikina, yeah.
Eric Burks.
Oh, Alec Burks. So Alec Burks is a good player. I think he'll probably end up on a contender closer to the trade deadline. He's a good player. He's one of those guys that injuries have really ruined his career. It's not that he can't play. It's just that he hasn't been able to stay healthy, and he's good enough to always get a job and always get a roster spot. He's a good player, but much like Marcus Morris was last year, he's better than the Knicks. So he should probably end up on a better team closer to the trade deadline.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if the Knicks start making some moves for basically nothing.
They shouldn't make 20 moves, man. They should stick with what they have, but they should just work on developing those guys and getting rid of some of those bad habits that some of their young players are starting to develop.
Yeah, but that's gonna take a lot to figure out down the road of the season. But who are we kidding? This is the New York Knicks.
True.
It's really the New York Knicks.
True.
But yeah, final takeaways from opening week. Like, what are the best games you watched this week?
Oh, definitely Houston and Portland last night was the best game I saw. Takeaways from so granted, it's just 2 games. It really doesn't mean anything. So I don't know. I don't want anybody saying, well, the first 2 games you said blah, blah, blah. This doesn't mean anything. We're just observing the 2 games for what they are. I'm not saying Golden State's not going to make the playoffs, but it's going to be a tough task for them to make the playoffs. They might have to change their offense a bit. I will say this, even though they were blown out, they were missing a lot of shots. That has probably had a lot to do with, lack of a proper training camp and summer league and things like that. They were missing a lot of shots. Milwaukee still plays exactly the same, which is not a good thing. It's still very, Giannis gets the ball, puts his head down, drive to the lane. That's what made you guys lose a couple years. I'm not sure how that's going to work out for them. Paul George has to redeem himself. And as much as Kawhi Leonard's escaped all criticism, even though he was the number 1 in the team and he played really poorly against Denver as well, he also needs to redeem himself. James Wiseman looks really good. That's a takeaway from the first 2 games. Anything else? 7-11 in Brooklyn. KD and Kyrie's look great. That's about it.
Yeah, that's really about it. But let's get to some football talk, even though in the mix of this recording, the Giants are getting steamrolled 20-3. I mean, that literally just started, but you're going to hear my thoughts of the Giants. This is the playoffs or about to miss the playoffs, depending on the results of this and the Washington football team in the very next episode. But right now, it's really not looking good for the New York Giants. It's really not. I mean, they came all the way back to get a division lead in a time with the Washington football team to suffer predictable blowout losses to Arizona and Cleveland and a predictable bad start to the Baltimore Ravens. Like, what do you think is the reason for the Giants' mess-ups these past couple of weeks? Was it more Daniel Jones being injured, and Colt McCoy not being the way he was during the win against Seattle Seahawks, or was it more like you were facing better teams with better offensive weapons?
I think it's all of the above. Colt McCoy is just not that good of a quarterback. No disrespect to him at all. And he's good enough to win you a game when we're not game planning for him, but he's not good enough to win you multiple games when we are game planning for him. So I think that added to it, the talent they went against is increased. And they're just not that good of a team. They got a hot streak a bit. They're in a horrible division, but they're just not that good of a team. It's just, if we're just being honest, they're just not. Like,
yeah, they really
sometimes sports is really not that complicated. They're just not that good of a team.
Yeah, and watching the New York Giants win streak, minus the Seattle Seahawks, all the wins, minus the Seattle Seahawks and the Philadelphia Eagles, all the wins literally came against bad teams.
And the Eagles are bad too.
Oh yeah, you can't forget that. I mean, but at least the Philadelphia Eagles, I mean, at the time of this recording, I mean, if they can defeat the Dallas Cowboys, they can actually stay in the playoff hunt for the final week of the season, but that's not going to happen because the Cowboys barely lose out. Let's be honest.
You think the Cowboys are going to win?
Possibly.
Listen, that division is so bad. Who cares, right? Like
that division is literally bad, but
they're horrible. They're just horrible.
It isn't bad. The Buffalo.
What happened?
One of the division isn't bad. Buffalo Bills.
Oh, the AFC East.
Yeah, the present season. Question the AFC East. Like, what are your impressions about them?
The Buffalo Bills?
Mm-hmm.
Josh Allen's taking that step, and he's looking like the player that he was projected to be. And also, the Patriots aren't really good, and the Jets are absolutely horrible. So, a lot of times, your success is dependent on how bad your division is. If you can beat up a couple of those teams, you're getting, 2-3 wins per season that adds on to your win total. But I think he's taking a natural step, and the team's playing really well.
Yeah, it's due to the fact that Tom Brady ended up going to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who literally blew out the Detroit Lions. But we know how good Tom Brady is. He doesn't lose to the Detroit Lions. That's not even worth the discussion at all. But
What do you think about do you think Cam Newton gets a starting job next year or even a backup job next year?
I hardly got it. That's not. It's not looking good. When he came to the Patriots, he did not look right at all. He called up my win against the New York Jets, but it's the New York Jets. They were barely good enough to beat the Los Angeles Rams, but they weren't really supposed to.
Well, the Jets are the worst team I've ever seen in my life. But I'm not even kidding. Going back to Cam Newton, he looks like he can't throw the football. Like something looks off with his throw and everything and his timing, and he looks like it's over. And it's a shame because, a couple of years ago he was MVP, he was in the Super Bowl and things like that. But I think it's over, and I think he'll be a commentator next season.
Yeah, just like Tony Romo. When his career went downhill, he's now.
Well, Tony Romo's career went downhill because of injury, not because of lack of performance. And I've always said this, as much as I'm a Giants fan, I'm never going to cheer for the Cowboys. A lot of times that they lost, his teammates never came through. Like, it wasn't because Tony Romo was terrible. His teammates never played well in important games.
Yeah, like, literally, I don't know what the Dallas Cowboys, they just so, well, they're not bad, but they just can't seem to win important games.
Yeah, well, that's good because I'm not a Cowboys fan, so they can keep losing.
Yeah, and it's good for me too. Like, what you expect?
Yeah, they can keep losing. I'm okay with that.
And I know you're okay with the Kansas City Chiefs trying to surpass the Pittsburgh Steelers for the top spot. Now the Steelers are on a losing streak.
Yeah, I actually haven't watched any of the Steelers game. What's been going on with them?
I mean, they did lose a couple games to the Washington football team, and then yeah.
Right, but is it injury? Is it just poor performance? What's been going on?
I mean, they just happened to stumble at the last minute in the other night against the Washington football team, and yeah.
No, I'm just laughing at their name that they call the Washington.
Yeah, I hate that name.
Yeah.
But since we're on the subject of talking sports in general, like throughout this entire 2020, or at least the fourth quarter of it, with the NFL and the NBA teams playing in their own courts again, like, what do you think about this whole not playing in front of fans thing? As we touched upon before you got on the podcast.
Oh man, it's been hard as a spectator and as a fan watching games that didn't have fans in the attendance. I can't imagine how it feels for the athletes. When I say that, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it's got to be very different from what you're used to. Especially, if you consider guys who, let's say, most players have played in college, whether it's one season, for basketball players or multiple seasons for football players. Those college arenas are rocking. They're very vocal. They're loud. You have that fan base. If you look at some of these teams and their home fields, whether it's Kansas City or Soldier Field or Lambeau or the Oracle's no longer around, but Madison Square Garden, some of these places where the fan base is rabid and they're loud and they're very passionate and vocal. And I'm not saying that those fans help teams win. We don't know, but they definitely added to the atmosphere of the sport and added to the intensity of the game and things like that. That's totally lacking. Like, these games, I'm not saying they're less important by any means, but they feel less important because you don't hear fan reaction. You don't hear the crowd yelling. And it also doesn't look very good. I've always said that. It looks really bad watching professional athletes play in an empty arena. It just looks weird. It's odd. It's very odd.
Yeah, I mean, I got used to it in WWE, but when professional sports did, and they did a much better job with the NBA bubble, but now that the NBA teams are playing in their own home courts again, it's just like...
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you brought it up. I think a lot of credit has to go to the NBA for the presentation of the bubble. It didn't look like they were just playing in an empty arena. They designed it with the fan interaction wall and everything like that. And to touch on WWE, them moving to a smaller arena and having also that digital fan, wall makes it look a lot better than just a blank shot of empty seats and things like that, which is what we're seeing now with the NBA, what we've been seeing with football. And it also looks weird when some arenas have fans and others don't. It's a very odd situation, but we totally understand why. We're not saying that we don't know why. We know why that is. and we hope much sooner than much later that it gets back to having fans in the arena, because it's odd. And I think I can honestly tell you it's taken away from the enjoyment of watching football games. You know, when it's fourth and inches and you don't hear the crowd rallying up, it's a very strange feeling.
Yeah, it really is. And well, as I mentioned before, you can still get some enjoyment from the games you watch. Like when you get excited off a crazy play, it don't even feel like as if you're watching it with no fans in attendance. But then again, when they have those camera angles pointing to the empty seats in some shape or form, you get a sense of it.
Yeah, I actually like the Knicks presentation for their game last night, where they had the courtside seats blocked off. I think that made it look much better than an empty shot of just like chairs. You know, it just doesn't look good. Again, I hope sooner than later, but it'll probably be a while before we really get fans back in the arena. And also, and I mentioned this before in a previous podcast, you know, our prayers and respects go out to those people who work in those arenas who can't work because, you know, those arenas are basically shut down outside of the immediate personnel for the teams. You know, the people who work in concession stands and stuff like that, and people who work in the corporate offices. You know, it's rough. They haven't been working, so it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been working. I mean, I've been working on this, but I haven't been. Geez, maybe it's bad, but not bad that you're unemployed during a global pandemic, just because of the fact that you gotta contribute at some point.
Right. Hopefully things get better, man.
Yeah, things will get better. That concludes this episode of Nothing But That Sports Talk. Thank you for stopping by, Knox. As always, a pleasure having you throughout the year during this quarantine. And yeah, hopefully in the future when this little thing comes to an end, we can get back to doing interviews in person since, yeah, let's be honest, I miss doing interviews in person.
Yeah, man, me too, man. We used to be side by side, and me and you going back and forth. Miss those days.
Yeah, but it can easily come back. But even if we can easily bring it back now that there's a certain medicine created for the certain